Well, very good, folks. Thanks for joining. This is going to be quite different from what you last saw. And I'm delighted to be back out here in Salt Lake. And as I was walking over here, seeing the flags for people to pick up as they're crossing the street, it's one of the things that we noted some years ago in a report that STPP issued when Rocky Anderson was your mayor, and we complimented him on his great strides on pedestrian safety. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about sustainability and transportation. And I'll take just a second and tell you about STPP. You may not be familiar with us. We have been a leader in the transportation world in advancing new directions for surface transportation for about 20 years. We got started in 1990 and have been at it ever since. And we focus on more travel options, the integration of land use and transportation, and involving you in the decision-making process, you, the citizens. And it seems as though our tide is finally maybe coming in with some people in Washington now and some things happening around the country as well. So sustainability, the framework, I'm sure you've heard about it already, but in the context of transportation, I thought I would take a moment and just put it in the context of seeing the community. And I was delighted to see in the last dance show that you had, the idea of place-based, because that really is what we're trying to get back to in transportation in many aspects. But the idea of three concentric circles, and this comes out of UN work, this little diagram, that the economy fits within society and they both fit within the environment. And that is, I think, a very important aspect of what we are trying to convey and get through people in my business's brains. Not always successfully, but we're making progress. Now, the idea of a sustainable transportation system, at this point, I would say there are better definitions of this in places other than in the United States. The one on your left is from Canada, and the one on the right is from UK. I'm not going to ask you to read it. It's way too many words for a slide, and I apologize for that. But the concept basically is to meet the fundamental access needs of our society in affordable, efficient ways that provide choices while we minimize and eliminate, to the extent possible, emissions and waste. That's the Canadian view. On the Brit side, competitiveness and a productive economy, I think this is very much now being woven into the idea of sustainability in the transportation world, as well as throughout all of sustainability, obviously driven in large measure by global warming and the need to reduce CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. Health is a new aspect being introduced into the transportation world, and there's some concern, I think, from folks in my field that this is really too extraneous, but I don't believe that it is. And when you think about how many people, even though we have killed fewer people than in many, many years, in this last year, we're still killing way too many. Almost 100 people a day die in this country in automobiles, and that's outrageous, in my view. But also the idea of physical activity. I'm at an age where I'm reading about how to stay young, right? Because I'm not anymore. And physical activity is definitely one of the things that needs to be in all of our programs. But in many ways, we've designed walking out of our lives. So how do we bring that back in so that it's not forcing us to take a trip to the mall, which we've driven to walk around the mall, but instead have communities in which we can walk to go and do the basic things in life, like get a quart of milk or rent a movie if we still do that. But anyway, broadening it out and tying very much transportation to quality of life in a very place-based way, and then also thinking very much about the equality of the kinds of transportation systems that we are providing. And so as I think about this, it really does mean rethinking exactly what the transportation mission is. And there are many senses of that. But as I have been through my transportation career, several things strike me. We need to move from being focused on moving vehicles to actually how do we efficiently move people and goods. We've talked about that for a long time, But we are not yet really walking that talk. In some places, certainly, but not on a national perspective. There are still far too many people in the traffic sections of state DOTs who want to make sure how many vehicles get through that intersection on a light cycle. And having to put in a timer for pedestrians is a real pain. So we need to move to a much more holistic view of the transportation system and what we're trying to do with it. Planning, particularly at a systems level, is not something that we have held in high regard in transportation. And there's federal requirements that everybody do a statewide or a regional long-range plan. And particularly at the state level, it is not always given as much credence as it should have. And what we really focus on is the projects. And everybody and their brother and sister wants a project. And they focus whether it's a bike project, a transit project, an intersection improvement, a interchange, or a widening of a road in order to accommodate some development. We don't think about outcomes, and we need to be thinking about shifting that. We have shaped much of our thinking coming out of the interstate era, which was built on the basis of 90% federal share, cost to complete. And every so many years, they re-estimated the cost to complete. That was an open invitation to basically buy mitigation from the public's total dismay when they finally caught up with what was going on, to say, wait a minute, we need to think about this differently. There's still some of that thinking in transportation agencies, and it doesn't get us. It starts out with the wrong premise, and it's very difficult to get to the right answer when you start out where that kind of thinking has led us. Quite often, because our agencies are single mode for the most part, a state DOT is basically a highway construction and more operating agency, a transit agency, we know what they do, and they don't do the other. I remember somebody from one DOT in the Midwest said to me, well, why should I care about transit? We don't do that. And so that's a challenge, the institutional structures that we have created, in some reasons for good purpose, but now they may have outlived their full utility. We have focused almost extensively on trying to keep up with the demand for supply rather than on managing the demand. And you all have led the nation, and everybody points to the Envision Utah process, but not that many places have done it and have then followed up in the way that you have going forward. And it must be now almost 15 years since that has happened. I'm not quite sure. I didn't look up the time frame, but it's been with you for quite a while. In the transportation community, we've also been quite reluctant to recognize the impact that putting major highways on the ground has had on land use. And say, oh, well, it has just happened. I remember in the days when I ran the New Jersey DOT, one of my chief engineers said to me, we were going along a new interstate highway, he said, I can't believe all this development that's happened out here. It used to be farm fields. I said, Milt, the road, do you get it? It's pretty amazing. We have also lived in the transportation world in pretty much of an accountability-free zone, if you will, particularly in terms of things that reach outside of pavement condition or bridge condition or level of congestion. We don't connect the dots so well. So what do we do about that? I suggest we have got to find ways to, at the national level, but this applies really to all levels as well, national, state, regional, and even local, putting in place a vision that really takes advantage of each form of transportation and putting it to its best use. Bicycles obviously have a place in our system. Walking clearly has a place in our transportation system, as do roads, transit of its many forms, trains, airplanes, and whatnot. But we haven't really rationalized all those pieces. We tend to layer one on top of the other. We've got to have much more of an integrated vision, but it needs to connect as well to a number of other things. And it's very heartening that the federal administration is linking the Housing and Urban Development, the DOT, and the Environmental Protection Agency together, and are just starting to really pull some of those programs together so that they're much more integrated. The idea of integrating, as I mentioned a moment ago, land use and transportation, so that we create mixed-use walkable neighborhoods and development patterns. What we're talking about is really a completely different setup in comparison to the road-based land development patterns. And it was interesting, I was out here a number of years ago, just as the post-Olympics, and until the light rail came in, one of your developers said to me, you know, we never really paid any attention to the transit system because it was just buses. And so it was sort of an irrelevant aspect to their lives. Now, of course, you all have had a complete turnaround and are advancing multiple corridors of fixed guideway transit investment. And there is all sorts of development that is following that. But this is not happening everywhere. And it is something that people, I think, until they really begin to see it in their communities, have a very hard time conceptualizing, because the land use patterns have to be fundamentally different if we're going to support walkable, mixed-use communities that allows us to go down to the corner and get our Starbucks, pick up a newspaper, and something we probably shouldn't eat along the way, but we enjoy it anyway, rather than getting in our car and going somewhere to get that. Another thing that's coming along is the linking of housing and transportation. As we try and pull together various programs, it doesn't matter what level of government, very difficult to bring housing, transportation, environmental programs, policies, and priorities all together. But they're beginning to do it in Washington, and it's going to start feeding out into the state and regional levels, because money has a magical way of drawing us to wherever it is. And if it has new conditions, then we follow that. We tend to anyway. We also have a very diverse and growing more so set of people who travel. And it's changing quite a bit from the goods movement side and as well as to the people movement side. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those things in a moment. And finally, accountability for real outcomes. And there's some things that I'll show you in a moment that I think reflect some new ways of thinking about it, not done by a transportation agency, done by an advocacy organization out in Seattle. So I'm going to focus a little bit on policies and planning, institutional practices, and educating and listening ourselves. And I assume because you all are here that you are part of the vanguard of people who will be out getting others to listen and think about what we should be doing. We're working in Washington now to try and get the federal law that needs to be reauthorized to include some national objectives. And fortunately, legislation has been introduced. It's not clear yet whether it will be included in the legislation, but at least there are 2 senators and several members of the House who have introduced legislation clearly spelling out some national objectives. We've really sort of lost a reason for there being a federal program except give me my money. And if that's all it's about, I'm not sure why we go through the effort, but because it has a lot of rules that go with it. And if we don't pay a lot of attention, then I'm not sure that there's a reason for a program. But there is, I think, lots of rationale for a program. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the 3 agencies are trying to align their programs, which is a real first. The last time I think that happened was in the Carter administration, which is 30 years ago or more, that we had a real effort to align programs, and also accountability and measuring performance. So these things are beginning to happen, and there are more and more examples of them around the country. In terms of planning, as I mentioned, this is not really something that states have focused a lot on except in project level. But thinking about different scales, I'm involved now with a group of rail interests around the country, and clearly there are national corridors that go from our gateway port areas across to major places like Chicago and to the east, and from the east out here, shipping goods and materials. We have interstate travel that is not gateway level, but we also have regional travel and we have local travel. All of these need to be thought about in terms of a network that integrates, because if the local level doesn't work, you're pushing trips up to the regional level. If the regional level doesn't work, you're pushing it up to the interstate. I live in Wilmington, Delaware, and I-95 goes smack through our city, and most of the traffic on that road is not through traffic. It's local traffic, going from Wilmington down to Newark to our university, or going downstate to our state capital or whatever. So that was not the original intent of those roads. It is certainly what they have become in all of our communities these days. We need, I think, to start in the planning regime justifying our projects and the decisions we make about how to invest limited money based on the goals we want to achieve. We don't often do that. we sort of back into it, but we don't sit and say, okay, if we want to have accessibility to transit for 80% of our population, what do we need to do? And then start figuring out what the list of projects and investments are. That is not the typical way that we develop a transportation program. Land use, I will mention often throughout my remarks, but I think that we can now start when we find friendly local governments, because state governments are never going to be the lead on land use. Who's here from local governments? Anybody? Local government people? A few. Recognizing how your decisions affect the transportation system. I was just in an eastern state meeting with the governor last week, and we talked a lot about this because they don't really have much of a connection between what local county commissioners do in terms of deciding what projects they want and what development they want and what impact that has on the state and its projects and its investment priorities. So there's a real disconnect there, and we talked about doing some things that would begin to get better alignment between state goals and some of the local governments in that particular state. This probably has 50 different ways that we approach it around the country, but it is certainly one area where we've got to start much more of a collaboration with the transportation folks and the local governments making development decisions, understanding the burdens they're putting on each other based on the kind of decisions each is making. Because we can do much better from a cost standpoint, from a livability standpoint, from an accessibility standpoint, from an equity standpoint, if we really start creating more mixed-use developments. And you're seeing them, I'm sure, along your transit lines as they're opening here. The long-range plan itself has got to have more goals that are meaningful, and it's got to be the document that drives our decision-making. Today, it really is the capital program. Can I get in there, which is what shapes what we do, as opposed to thinking about what are we trying to accomplish, what do we have to do to get where we want to be. And that means revising a whole lot of processes and procedures in terms of prioritization and other things like that. So national objectives, accountability, systems planning, regional decision-making, giving greater authority. The Brookings Institute in Washington has done a lot of work on metro economies, and they really are what is driving this nation's economy today. Metro economy. So we need to make sure that in these regions, like this one and the 300 or 400 others around the country, that there is more say in terms of how you grow and how you prosper. And it probably requires some rather dramatic restructuring of the federal programs, which we hope will happen. There's some talk about that. How far we'll actually go, it's not clear. In terms of institutions, figuring out ways. We're not going to tear down state DOTs. We're not going to tear up transit agencies, but we need to figure out in many places how they can work more collaboratively together. They've done it here. We've done it here in this state to some degree in Colorado with their T-Rex line and the DOT and the highway. They needed each other, so it was sort of, as the former director of the transit group out there, or back there said, a forced marriage, but nonetheless it was a marriage, and they came together and they made two projects happen. And we're seeing more of that, and we're hoping to be able to start doing more work in this area, because there are places in this country where you talk to the transit people, they'll say, well, we don't ever really talk to the DOT, and vice versa. That is not healthy in the world we live in today. Finding institutional structures that will address multi-state national corridors. When something comes into the Port of LA Long Beach, most of it doesn't stay in that region. It's probably could be coming right through Utah going to Chicago. But there's no reason why Utah should have to bear the burden of all the expense of what's happening here to you. How do we organize that? There's some interesting things going on in Washington that may lead us in some new directions there as well, forming corridors. Railroad companies, unlike state DOTs, operate across multiple state boundaries. Two major ones out here, and on the other side of the Mississippi also two major ones. But they're thinking multiple states as they look at corridors, and in fact, the federal government just awarded $1.5 billion in grants, and three top grants were to intercity freight rail projects, multiple states, with the exception of one being just in the Chicago area, which is a major bottleneck. Figuring out how to better tackle regional issues is another challenge that we get into conflicts between what local governments want to do with their land use authority, what is best for the region at large and what the state is able to invest in, and the transit agency as well. Clearly, in this arena, you all are way ahead of a lot of people, and I know that several folks, Bob Groh and some others, have been all over the country for years talking to people about how you pulled it off here. And it's taken in some places and not anywhere near in as many places as it should and needs to. But we may be moving somewhat in that direction. Getting to processes where we can look across transportation proposals, whether it be for a rail project, a transit, highway project, and figuring out which is the best investment. I just read something that came from the UK where they've decided they're not expanding major intercity highways anymore. They're going to go with rail. They did a lot of analysis over the last 10 or 15 years to come to that conclusion, and it's something that we're not quite there yet in this country, although I have hope because the Federal Railroad Administration is now putting together a national rail plan, and that may give us great more visibility in the rail sector to get people thinking about really what is the best investment when we look at these major corridors and within sort of the mega regions of the country, how we can connect things in ways that are much more sustainable than what we have done up until now. There are lots of other ways we can do things in terms of using the federal funds that flow to the state DOTs. Most people have no idea that about 2/3 of those dollars are eligible to be used for transit should the local decision-making apparatus decide to do that. And we have also, in terms of how we design highway facilities and roads and streets, a lot more flexibility than people are aware of. And these are some things that I hope we can focus on, not so much right now today, but going forward in terms of being much more holistic in terms of how we think about what our transportation facilities should be like. Now, these are a couple of surveys. I think also, as happens quite often, the public gets out way ahead of elected officials and institution agencies, bureaucrats. And the two statistics that I have here for you, one is actually done by Chris Nelson, some work here at the university, showing the change, the dramatic change that's taking place in our households. We are seeing basically from between 2000 and 2040 a huge shift in households without children, which has all sorts of implications about what kind of housing product we need and what kind of transportation we need, because when we change the nature of the housing product, we can also dramatically change the nature of our transportation system. The other thing that's happening is the change in the age profile in this country and the big swing of huge numbers of increases in people 65 and older. And where they want to live, and this is from a survey taken about 4 or 5 years ago by the National Association of Realtors and Smart Growth America, in a city or a suburb that's close to a city, that's over half of folks interviewed in this survey. A suburb away from the city, less than 20%, and then the 30% want to live in a totally really rural community. So this is a very big shift from what we have seen in the past, and we need to be listening to that. And I've just gotten, I haven't had time to totally absorb it, some information from the regional planning group in the Washington metro area. And one of the things it shows is that the 16 to 34 age group, I think, trips taken over the last 7 years has actually declined. And the surmise, and that's all it is right now, is that with Twittering and Facebook and all this instant communication, these people don't have to get out and see each other all because they are in 24/7 contact. And it may be one of those things, this is just sort of popped up on the radar screen, that may have as much of an impact on travel in this country as women entering the workforce did 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Unknown at this point, but keep your eye out on that. And maybe the Wasatch Front Regional Council wants to do some surveying as they have done back in the Washington metro area. I find this to be absolutely fascinating. I have no idea what's really going on, but just this popped out when they got these numbers back, and I thought it was a very, very interesting statistic. So the demographic changes, I think we really, that's the kind of living that a lot of people want now, that they don't find it. The costs of transportation is another thing that's entering in the discussion much more than it has been in the past. We always look at housing costs. We've never married the two until very recently. And this is something that is going to, I think, be much more visible going forward. A companion organization of ours is releasing next week a Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, Center for Neighborhood Technology. And what we learn in this is that vast portions of the income cohorts, particularly if you're below 50,000 annual income, which is a large percentage of the country, your transportation costs can be almost as high and in some cases higher than your housing costs. This is something that nobody thinks about because we just assume we're getting in the car and driving. But we have created a very much of a expensive transportation system, which as we try and get back on our economic feet may not be the exact place where we want to be in. I mentioned the demographics and clearly the external threats which are slowly being absorbed into the transportation community. Energy security and costs, we're seeing all over the news in the last few days, gasoline going up over $3 a gallon, which it already is in California. I haven't seen a gas station sign since I arrived here earlier today, so I'm not sure what your price is, but back in the East, we're up around $2.70, so it's not too much of a jump to get to $3. And $4 is not that far back in our memory. We still have that. So this is a huge issue and one that I think does speak to our economic competitiveness, because if we're spending money there, we're not spending it somewhere else on education or entertainment or going out for dinner or something else. Clearly, global warming, once if we ever, please ever, get past dealing with health care, maybe we'll take on some other issues, and this is one that is very much, I know, on the President's agenda, as is our economic competitiveness, and the transportation system has a huge role to play in that. So bringing alignment in terms of consistency with sustainability in this arena, getting land use and transportation together has got to happen, and it's not going to come from the federal level. There can be some carrots and there might be some sticks, but it is going to come from regions like this, where you've thought about it and you've decided that the values of your community are such that you really want to have a community that offers opportunities and access for a lot of people, while also protecting the environment and the resources that make this area such a choice place to live, as well as then positioning yourself from a cost perspective to be competitive, not just with the contiguous 48, but around the world, which is clearly more and more the case. And so there are lots of things in that regard. Now let me just show you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that people are beginning to do in terms of measuring transportation performance and the relationship of land use. This is from Seattle, and as I mentioned earlier, this is from a group called Sustainable Transportation out there. A lot of data exists. Woefully, the transportation people think none of it is enough for what they think about, but we don't put it together to tell a story that really gets into our hearts and our minds, which is where we have to do in order to change things, I think. So what they're doing, and this is just about 3 examples I'm going to show you. What's the newly developed land in relationship to the growth in the population? And you can see here, in this case, in King County, between 1996 and 2004, the population grew at double the rate of developed land. Now that is a great way to measure how fast you're spreading out, how much more infrastructure you need to add. In Ohio, Cuyahoga County, which surrounds Cleveland, in 1950 they had about 1.4 million population. In 2000 they had about 1.4 million, and the difference is the area of development was just a small node back in 1950. Today it covers the whole county. Think about that from an economic standpoint. It's economic suicide because you're spreading out a huge infrastructure base that you have to pay for, and you have the same number of people, basically. They have a few thousand more, but not many. That is not smart economics. And that is something I think that this table particularly is telling. This is another one from this is actually from King County report, where they're showing the difference in multifamily permits between 96 and 2000 and 2001 and 2005. And if you look, I don't know if I have a pointer, yeah, here at the, this is the units per acre in that time period, the first time period, and the units per acre in the second time period. And the thing that's, I don't know anything about where these areas are, so I don't know whether this is good or bad. But the point is, it has gone up tremendously. And I can only believe that these are areas where they're trying to focus their growth, because they have very much of a program to do that. But pulling that together and having a story to tell, pictures often tell a lot more than words. In this one, you can see on the left-hand side that half, and this is again King County, half of the greenhouse gas emissions in that region come from on-road transportation. This chart on the right shows, and the high bar is driving alone to work. So it's called, aha, yeah, I understand why it's so high. But we don't put that story together very often either, to really show what we're doing to ourselves and why that result is coming from this in the main. Although work trips are actually a very small portion of our travel these days, so this may not be a perfect measure. Problem is, we don't measure anything except work trips, which is a great major problem in the transportation world. So, action, I would suggest to you, to get to a sustainable transportation system is required at all levels of government. And it's got to be sort of a push-pull, because the federal government is often not going to lead. It can incentivize, but for wholesale change to take place, it needs to already be going on out here in what I always like to call the real world, to get enough critical mass so that it's safe for people in Washington to do something. It's the same at the state level. People aren't going to get themselves too far out on a limb unless they feel there is enough political support, popular support, for an issue. So we come back to the local level and the regional level, where we really need to start putting in place the changes that will build up. But it can also have gentle pressure, as a friend of mine who for years ran the planning organization in the San Francisco Bay Area, carrots, sometimes sticks painted orange. And so there are lots of ways to get there. Clearly there needs to be leadership. You had that in your state to do Envision Utah. Recognizing and acting upon the linkages between these sectors. I don't think we're at a point in our history, economic, environmental, social, you name it, where we can afford to do things in modal or in sector silos. They are all connected, and we need to start finding ways to really begin to make those connections and to have those collaborations. I remember a story from a friend of mine who succeeded me in New Jersey, running the transportation department there. They had a big interchange they wanted to build, but they said, before we're spending any money, we better go talk to the local people to make sure they don't screw this up, because we won't be back here for 100 years. So they went with some trepidation to go and talk to the mayor, and they did not get the pushback they anticipated. And the commissioner of transportation said, well, I'm amazed you didn't scream and holler at me. And the mayor simply said, you've never come and talked to me before. Aha. So it's maybe not as hard as we think. And reaching out and understanding each other. I'm doing some work now in Ohio where we're bringing together a number of state agencies to think through, to mirror what's going on at the federal level, so that they can try and attract some additional resources and change their own thinking with the incentive of the federal funds. And finally, there never can be enough of engaging and informing ourselves, our elected officials, our civic leaders, and our citizens. And it goes in all directions in terms of that job, to build a sense of where we want to go and how we want to get there, because it is that collective sense of the future that will take us to a true point of sustainability. And we can say now that the funding constraints we're living under, it's a great handle, but there may be a time when that's not a problem to the extent that it is today. And so we better have grounded a good sense of direction for where we're trying to go. And with that, I will say thank you and be very happy to have any questions or discussions.